Hello and welcome to Earthcast, a platform for discussions about bridging the resource gap between people and planet. I am Olivia Taylor, or Olivia Earth on the socials, your host, and I will be interviewing a series of change makers, thinkers and disruptors, and asking them about their areas of expertise. Together, we will discover fresh perspectives and the most useful levers in society for change. The main question that we will explore is how are trade-offs made between people, planet and profit? More specifically, how do we solve wicked problems and make decisions at the margin? If you would like to hear more from Earthcast, subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Today I have joining me a filmmaker who focuses on stories that matter. Welcome, Jolynn Minnaar. Jo is an award-winning South African director who I've often heard described as fearless. Her films have screened at many prestigious festivals, and for her documentary work, she is one of the Mail and Guardian's top 200 young South Africans, Glamour Women of the Year, as well as a member of the prestigious 21 Icon family. Jo's passions lie in capturing intimate, insightful portraits that challenge perspectives and inspire new thought. Jo and I actually met a few years ago when I was on a youth forum for people and wildlife run by the International Fund for Animal Wildlife. I was fangirling really hard as I already knew about Jo's documentary, Unearthed, which is about the fracking industry, particularly in the Karoo. We met briefly and I got a copy of Unearthed, which I still have today. However, I was also watching a lovely Johnson's ad the other day, which features one of my favorite Cape Town local artists, Amy Ayanda, and I also noticed that you directed that as well. But I digress. Since watching Unearthed, I've been wondering, what issue is most concerning you at the moment, and what is inspiring your next award-winning documentary?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me and for that very generous introduction. I feel like I've just had the daily affirmation that I so desperately required. So thank you for those kind words. In terms of issues that are concerning me or inspiring me at the moment, I mean, I think there's so many, right? We only have to sort of look around at the world around us right now. But I think for me in my work, it's always something. It's an issue or a story that strikes a chord personally. It's usually out of circumstances that I find myself in, or something that I'm personally drawn to explore, to express. I know there's like other filmmakers who have sort of different approaches where it's slightly more sort of strategic and intellectualizing aspects of topics they want to explore. For me, I sort of really have to respond to it on an intuitive level. So that's usually kind of how I stumble into the stories that I work on. I mean, I think of Unearthed was really quite an accidental discovery. I was born in the Karoo and I grew up there, and there were these rumors of something called fracking that was being proposed. I knew nothing about it, but as a young South African, I was quite interested in what it could mean from a economic development point of view, knowing that the Karoo really lacks job creation and opportunity. So I was quite a sort of controversial figure at the dinner table, my dad being a farmer and all farmers in the Karoo being quite opposed to shale gas extraction from a sort of environmental point of view. So that was an interesting adventure that then sort of ended up taking 3 or 4 years, and then resulted in a feature documentary that took me to the United States, sort of the home of fracking, so to speak, where I spent several months on my own with a camera, really just documenting what was happening on the ground. But I think since then, like I remember shortly after Unearthed, this amazing woman, Hillary, who was sort of like my fixer on the ground in the States. She was just this incredibly generous soul who, I think she was like in her 60s or 70s, drove me around the country and just was so kind in letting me sleep like on her couch and things. And she sort of sadly passed away a couple of months after Unearthed came out. And then I sort of responded to the idea of loss and the idea of aging with a short film sort of documentary called Velma Veronica, which really explores the idea of aging and aging alone, as well as Alzheimer's, which was in that the sort of very generous gentleman who allowed me to film him in his retirement home. And then, a couple of years ago in 2019, I made a film called Womanhood, which was a wonderful brand collaboration with First for Women Insurance and Vice, that really allowed me creative freedom to create a body of work that would in some way place a finger on the pulse of what it means to be a woman in South Africa, particularly with just the staggering gender-based violence that women in South Africa face. And last year I made a music video that sort of explored or interpreted manhood, this idea of an ode to men out there who are showing up and doing the work, trying to sort of establish that there are men out there who are unlearning and making themselves vulnerable. Definitely a big impact or sort of big impression from Black Lives Matter and the loss of George Floyd and Collins Khoza locally. So I kind of, for me, it's more of an organic process. It really has to be something that moves me deeply for me to be able to respond authentically. And I also enjoy kind of debunking the format itself. I sort of am always quite controversial at film expos and festivals where I speak about, making Unearthed, which was a featured documentary, but it was really, really tough to make it because it's just sadly the documentary form is really under-supported in South Africa. I think with the SABC and just sort of funding is quite a challenge here, and it's not the easiest thing to complete a feature documentary. So I'm always encouraging filmmakers, if there's a topic that you want to talk about or explore faster than what it takes to make a feature doc, which is easily, 4 or 5 years, look at short films, look at different, like, the music video was in like a different change of pace for me last year. Look at Insta stories, look at photography, look at art. I think there's many ways in which we can tell stories that matter. And I think one can continually reinvent the medium that you're using to sort of share your message as well.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jo. And I also wanted to know, so how do you think about telling your next story, given what you've learned from Unearthed and the whole process of storytelling? And then further from that, I'm really interested in fracking and about one particular question that I'll ask you a little bit later, but what is your worst myth about the fracking industry that you would like to dispel?
So Unearthed was a film that I made when I was really young. I was 21 when I started working on it, and my main focus then was really just getting to the bottom of things from a like an investigative point of view, rather than it was about film craft or style. That was not even on my radar. I just had so much on my shoulders to do the story justice in terms of how much time I'd spent researching this and how many incredible sources I had and very generous people who allowed me to interview them and allowed me into their home. So for me, that was like really my main focus with Unearthed, was I suppose doing right by the story and presenting a really sort of a nuanced perspective that also asks big questions at the end, admitting that I'm also just a filmmaker and this is sort of what I found, and how can this body of work contribute to the overall conversation. And I think from there, I kind of wanted to return more to exploring the other end of the spectrum, which is more the aspects of storytelling, of style, of sort of film craft, of finding my voice, because Unearthed was kind of far more on that end of the spectrum of being more sort of journalistic. So I think how I tell stories is constantly changing. It's really asking many questions before you set off. It's sort of, what are we exploring? What's the best way to do that? And how can we capture it in a way that that does the story justice while also creating something that's really powerful or beautiful to watch? So I think for me, it's definitely been a journey, as much as that is the most cliche word. But over the last decade, if I just look at who I was 10 years ago, starting out on Unearthed, and where I am now, I've really enjoyed the opportunities to be able to flex and to find myself and to continually update myself. I think that's like a big thing that I'm grateful for what I'm able to do as a film director, and I hope that I can keep doing that. I don't really just want to be known for one thing. I kind of want to be able to adapt and explore and express and be more on my toes. And then moving over to the sort of least favorite myth about the fracking industry. Gosh, there were so many. I mean, I know it was really sort of this sort of narrative structure was really built on sort of unpacking the common myths that the fracking industry would use in order to promote this idea of hydraulic fracturing. I mean, that was this idea that there are absolutely zero documented cases that fracking has ever contaminated water sources. And the film really sort of unpacked that. And, those documented cases really refers to non-disclosure agreements, of which there are many, many cases of people who've been really badly impacted by contaminated waters, contaminated or sort of polluted air, and so that was really the main thing behind Unearth. And I think back then I really was I was way more in touch with like the many things that were frustrating me about the industry. But I think if I look back now, with that perspective, I think the overall thing that really frustrated me, and that was also something I used to get a lot in my interviews with gas companies and fossil fuel industries, was I think also because I was quite young and because I was a woman, I was often just dismissed anyway. But on top of that was this idea that that the world isn't ready to transition to renewable energy. That any thinking of a fair or just or equitable green economy is entirely impossible, and that it should be ruled out. And those arguments where you just you're still getting those today. It's like those are very carefully positioned arguments to maintain the status quo. I think they're cowardly, and I think they're designed to serve sort of elite corporate interests. I mean, we have so much technology available today. We're busy sending cars into space. We're busy prepping for life on Mars. We really can, if we want to, put our heads together and try and figure out how to make the leap to a far more sustainable way of living. But it takes political will. It takes undoing rampant sort of runaway capitalism. We need more decentralization, more localization. We need local community ownership. We need just equitable ways of earning incomes, of sort of tossing out consumerism. And I think, if you think of like how the world got together to fight COVID-19 and the race to develop vaccines, it's like, why aren't we getting together like that to fight climate change? So I think that was always something that really frustrated me, was just that it was impossible, that I should just pipe down with this sort of pipe dream rather than being like, guys, we have all the technology available right now. Let's stop investing in sort of fossil fuel research, which, the United States subsidizes fossil fuels sort of exploration and expansion heavily. It always has, for 100 years. And I think that's something that needs to change. Divesting has gained a lot of momentum since I started with Unearth, when it was still this sort of new idea of divesting funds from fossil fuel corporations, and hopefully that just continues to grow from strength to strength. I think just this idea of shutting down a new chapter or a new dawn because it doesn't really serve the current economic system or climate, that just infuriates me.
As you were speaking, I was snapping my fingers going, yes, girl, but you couldn't hear me. I definitely agree with what you're saying. And that is also a myth that really bothers me. It's a really lazy way to deal with the issue. Oh no, well, we're not really it. The world's not ready. So I completely agree with you.
I mean, to add another thought, it's kind of, no, it's what you were saying now. I mean, I really think that it's those excuses are absolutely lazy. And they're also very strategic, because you're deliberately limiting the discussion to suit one sort of way of doing things. And for me, it just kind of feeds into everything that's wrong in the world right now, into these sort of existing dominant power structures that need to be undone, into workplaces that aren't representative, into education systems that aren't inclusive and not allowing those voices
Absolutely.
to be empowered, and then to enter the workplace as well, to throw their weight behind sort of a different point of view. And it really is like, for me, it's like really symptomatic of like the overall sort of power systems that need to be dismantled or just changed. And hopefully that we are sort of we are chipping away at that. And I mean, I haven't been at the forefront of sort of fossil fuel extraction storytelling for the last few years. So I would be cautious to say that my finger is on the pulse, but I do sense that you know, we haven't seen that massive shift as much as the science is abundantly clear that climate change is here, and we are really seeing the impacts. And we were when I was, you know, making Unearthed. It's just like the fact that we haven't really caught on to that from like a global shift point of view is super frustrating, when most laymen would say that that's something that they'd be interested in. But you know, the political and corporate structures are enjoying the way things are at the moment.
So we know conclusively that fracking, and especially the lack of rehabilitation afterwards, is really bad for the environment and for local communities for a number of reasons, including cancer poisoning from the water, etc. But why is it still even being considered? Is it really just all about the money?
That's an interesting question, because I'm like, I think, I mean, yeah, I'd like to think that I'm inherently sort of quite an optimist, right? I feel like that suits my energy better. So, you know, often when I do work on these stories and you watch films and it like all comes down to like greed as the motive, I'm like, but really, are we really that basic as human beings? And, you know, so often you find that is the case. So yeah, I think, you know, in South Africa particularly, though, it's slightly different. I think if you look at, when I was spending a lot of time in the States, and I was really sort of uncovering a lot of cases and really getting very, very close to sort of some sketchy, dangerous places that I should not have been in on my own, but bless your naivety of your 20s. The States is very much like about greed, I think, there, in terms of money, extraction industry. It's been there for a long time. It's kind of a part of the American sort of fabric in a way, particularly if you look at those sort of states where that's always been the case. If things like, you know, West Virginia, if it was like the timber industry, then it was the gas industry and that kind of thing. But I think in South Africa it was different, because shale gas was being and is being promoted as a way to change our energy mix. This sort of idea that this will help us get off our massive reliance on coal, which is something we do need to address. I mean, we like the majority of South Africa's energy comes from coal, and that's incredibly outdated and worrying. But at the same time, you know, shale gas isn't necessarily the silver bullet. I mean, there's serious questions as to how long this will take to come online and how expensive it will be, because you're drilling twice the depths here than you are in the States. So it's a lot more costly. And South Africa doesn't have any gas infrastructure at all. So like massive questions around how that's really going to be like a meaningful variable in terms of shaking up our energy mix. And I think outside of that, in South Africa, you know, we also desperately need job creation and upliftment in rural areas. I come from the Karoo, and I like drive through, you know, many Karoo towns when I go home, and it's quite easy to get behind any kind of massive industry that'll set up shop in these areas where trade is struggling, where those socioeconomic disparities, you know, just continue. And I think this is really like the nexus, this nexus of energy pressure with rolling power cuts from Eskom, and, you know, a desperate need for employment and economic stimulation. You can see why something like fracking could be an attractive offer. And, you know, that's why it's for me, it's a far more challenging conversation in South Africa. And, you know, I struggled with that a lot with Unearthed, because I was initially very optimistic about it as a young South African. And, you know, it's hard. You can really get, these conversations can be really difficult, especially as a white privileged filmmaker from the Karoo. It's very easy for me to wave the flag of like the environment and climate change when there are people who have been systematically held back with South Africa's past, and who are like, you know what, I just want a fair chance of being able to have a stable income. And I think that's why it remains and was a very difficult conversation to have in South Africa. And, you know, hopefully I was able to get that, you know, do those nuances justice in the film, and try and just present information and just, you know, ask a ton of questions.
It's so interesting that you mentioned the uptake of renewables and And you were also talking about just transitions earlier, and whether this new energy transition that is happening is, will it leave people behind, or will it be just? And to quote my lecturer at Stellenbosch University, Mark Swilling, he said something very optimistic the other day, and he said, we mustn't forget how quick the uptake of renewables have been, and that they've beat some of the most positive climate models or models that were done in the past that looked at how quickly we could uptake renewables. So that is one thing I wanted to add, which is quite perhaps interesting to note as well.
No, absolutely. That is so true. And if you also if you think, I think, again, just going back to the vaccines and just seeing how quickly, when given a serious threat, the world can really rally behind something, is like, it's amazing. I mean, here we are a year later, and we've, you've got many countries just sort of pushing ahead of South Africa. We've only, really rolling it out now with the healthcare workers and things, but it's like, wow, can we not get behind like a much bigger cause, which is really like threatening our existence, such as climate change? But I agree, absolutely. And I think that's definitely something that we can be positive about, is that thankfully there are alternatives, with shale gas. If shale gas was the only thing that was being proposed in the Karoo as like the only way in which we could develop those communities and to help change our energy mix, then that would be a different conversation. But the massive sort of elephant in the room is that it is not the only option that we have.
Absolutely, I agree with you. But Jo, I want to move on quickly. I want to ask you, at the moment, influencers and role models, who do you look to for inspiration in your work? And what guidance do you have for young people going into an overly saturated industry, competing with platforms such as TikTok?
I get this question a lot, and I think I've been very strict in terms of how I sort of curate my sort of Instagram feeds and those kind of things. So I'm really just dialed into like amazing, talented, real, genuine people who are making their mark in many, many different fields. And so that's really helped me, I suppose, just feel like I'm in this ecosystem of support and goodness. I think, a good friend of mine who I met while making Unearthed, Ariel, who's from New York, he always hailed arts and science. This idea that if you were to invest your money and time or your attention anywhere, it should be in arts and the science. And I think I'm incredibly inspired by women and BIPOC leaders in arts and science, and particularly in South Africa. I'm just so humbled by and like an absolute awe of the work being done by Noel and Pragna Koch at NUF in Durban, where they're building inclusive wildlife film communities and empowering Black filmmakers to participate in a space that's usually dominated by white storytellers. And it's just been amazing to see what they've done in such a short amount of time. And it's so necessary when we look at conservation and wildlife and allowing South Africans and Africans to take ownership of their sort of natural their natural sort of resources and their sort of where they come from and the wildlife and the ecosystems that are in that space, rather than sort of BBC crews or Nat Geo crews kind of flying in and telling those stories. They're amazing people. I think of the botanist Rupert Koopman. I just love that he's in my feed and that I can see the work that he's doing, particularly in the Cape sort of ecosystems. Roshana Gray, who's working under Felt and Sea and just doing amazing work, educating people around foraging and what's in our backyard. Paula Kahumba in Kenya. They're incredible people out there and working, from all ends of the spectrum, from sort of more arts world, which is like filmmakers and storytellers and photographers, to people, amazing scientists and botanists and that kind of thing. And I think I'm excited to see it. I just sort of hope that my echo chamber is being reflected meaningfully in the world out there. I think with your question around TikTok and sort of young people trying to get into an industry that's really quite saturated. Again, I suppose I sort of go back to what I said earlier around formats. I'm slightly sort of format agnostic. which is quite controversial as a filmmaker, because I'm supposed to be hailing the feature film as like the holy grail. But I don't think it's necessarily bad that there's so many platforms. I think what is tough though is finding your voice and backing yourself in a world where authenticity is harder and harder to trace. So I think for me, that's really the nugget, is like, you tell your stories, find, like your cause that you want to get behind. I think there's amazing ways you can do that. I often have rallied behind causes or been more effective as a citizen watching a cause unfold on Instagram, on Insta stories, than I have been waiting for that film to come out for 4 years, when that cause has we've sort of missed the opportunity. So for me, platforms, I don't know, I think they're unique opportunities there, and storytelling has just got to sort of change to suit those mediums. But I do think for me the concern is more on a broader level, is not the concern. I think on a broader level is more like, if I were to offer any words of advice, it would be to sort of just trust your authenticity, to sort of just work really hard on finding what that is, and when you do think you have a sense of it, just stick to it and just keep nurturing it. The industry can be really, really tough, and it doesn't always reward that kind of thing. And you're always thinking you should be changing and swapping. And there's a lot of imposter syndrome in this industry. I don't know if it's just me, but I get the sense that a lot of people struggle with that. And I think if you can overcome that, if you can really find your voice, and if you can nurture it and work with integrity, then you're A for a way. I think for me, that's the biggest challenge. It's not so much about platforms. The good always wins, and you're always going to get the audience. It's just about trusting yourself.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I actually asked particularly because I've got a couple of close friends who are in film, and I'm always wondering how they're going to be, perhaps not competing is the wrong word, but shining, using their authenticity in this industry. But I want to ask you another question. So I found this quote that you said, and I'm going to read it to the audience. This is why the world is at a crossroads. We need to make a massive decision. Are we going to continue with this era of extreme energy, or are we going to try and do things better? Are we going to prioritize the transition to a low or carbon-free future? This is where the South African government is currently sitting. So what are your predictions, given the access to information that you have from researching on Earth and knowing people in the industry, both good and bad?
Well, the South African government, when I was working on Earth, there was the moratorium was placed on drilling in order for them to do more research, and it was quite a cautious approach from the government. And since then, I think the government, once they came out with the regulations, they certainly have just said that they are in support of fracking and exploring for shale gas. I think that, and you're seeing it, in Botswana and other countries flaring up as well. But I think the question is really, how long will this energy take to come online, or sort of to become a part of our energy mix, and at what cost? And I think in that cost, we really have to include the massive amounts of methane that's leaked and deliberately flared, because you have to when you're drilling for gas with fracking, which really undermines any claims that it's a cleaner fuel. I mean, methane is far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So there's a lot of sketchy data around the fact that it's cleaner. And I think you also have to say, in all this time, because it just is this like really massive industry. And I think because countries like South Africa or Botswana or anywhere else outside the United States doesn't have an existing gas infrastructure to tap into, it's like in all this time we've been trying to figure out how we're going to do this, how are we going to afford this, how are we going to build the roads to these places, how are we going to find the handful of people that we're going to employ in that area. Is there a chance for something else? And is there a chance for renewable energy from really successful programs such as the Independent Power Procurement Program to take hold? And I think you've already seen that. Like I was working on Earth with this idea that it was going to happen. Not idea, but I mean, it was definitely like the talk of the town back then. And it was like any minute now, Shell was going to drill a hole, and for sure, that was also like a part of the hype, because they obviously supposed to explore for gas and sort of do feasibility studies and EMPs and things. So yeah, I think looking back now, it's been interesting that, you know, the industry hasn't really taken off. Who knows what could happen tomorrow? But in all this time, renewable energy and the sort of technology around that has been improving and been taking hold. And I think it's just amazing that in South Africa, we're not having the discussion of like, well, what about renewable energy? We literally have an incredibly successful program through the independent power producers, and that's just been like incredible to see. So yeah, I think that for me is kind of always been the thing. It's like, really, it's about time and money and allowing that to play out more than it is about like corporate powers expediting things to suit themselves, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, I definitely hear what you're saying. But Jo, I sense you have a pretty unrelenting search for the truth. So how do you manage the gray areas in, for example, showing empathy and giving privacy, you know, or capturing something raw and authentic with the ability to change minds? What are some of the trade-offs that you play with in storytelling in your industry?
Oh, such a good question, because I'm definitely I'm a director who would immediately switch off a camera if the person in front of the camera was feeling uncomfortable, or if it wasn't serving them anymore. And I think that I know many film directors would do the opposite, because that's great storytelling, right? Those are like the nuggets you want on camera when someone starts crying or they show that they're uncomfortable. It's like those are like gems that you look for in the edit. But I can just never do that. There were many moments in Unearth or like interactions that I had with people where I just didn't roll on that moment because it wasn't fair. Like that person had just lost a loved one. So did the film suffer for that? Did it lose its gravitas? Maybe, but I'm sort of dialed slightly differently. For me, it's always working with integrity and respect for the person that's in front of the lens. And that's still something, anyone who works with me now, whether it's in dark or commercials, they know that's like a big part of how I work. It's conducive, respectful, calm environments, and it's sort of a flat hierarchy, and we're all equals and we're all working on this together, and everybody has to respect the person who's sharing their story. I mean, that's a real person in front of the lens with their name on the screen, and they're, you know, they're entering an exchange, and that's an incredibly generous one. So I think for me, I'm incredibly incredibly dedicated to always making sure that we're working with authenticity, that we're checking our blind spots, that we have a research team that's diverse and that's informing us and calling us out when we're making errors while shooting. And yeah, I mean, I often wonder, like in years to come, if I look back at my body of work and wish that I, you know, hadn't stopped rolling and like gotten in there and got in the drama or whatever it is. But I don't know. I didn't really think, for me, it's more important I can sleep at night knowing that I've sort of did my best as a filmmaker and a storyteller, but I could still call those people or approach them, and that we, you know, we still have a good relationship. So, I mean, in terms of advice and how you manage those gray areas, yeah, I think you just have to have a really strong handle on your gut and your intuition. If it feels strange, if it feels unethical, it probably is. And I think just approach it as a human being first, rather than a filmmaker. Like that's a tough thing. It's something that you're always going to wrestle with, right? Because filmmaking is incredibly competitive, and there's a lot of pressure on you when you do get the opportunity to like raise funds for an independent film, to go out there and then just like get it all in the can. But yeah, I think you have to just remember yourself as a human being first, and that the person you're dealing with as a human being as well, and sort of let that inform your decisions.
That's lovely advice. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. So I've recently been reading a book called Rock Water Life by Leslie Green, and it looks at Cape Town.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you've read the book, but it looks at Cape Town from a whole lot of different perspectives in the first couple of chapters. And what really struck me is it looks at Cape Town from perspectives that I've never heard of before, obviously learning history of South Africa from, the colonizer's perspective. You hear only a certain side of history, which I've now tried to unlearn and relearn. So reading this book, it talks about the name of Table Mountain, which is the obviously big famous mountain in Cape Town, whose name was Hurikwacho back in the day before the colonizers arrived. It was the people, the Kowena, who lived there. I really want to understand the difference between perception and reality, between going into an area and filming it and what you actually see. And I ask this because I've lived and worked in Cape Town CBD and have a very romanticized and privileged notion of my city. So that's why I ask you this.
It's a massive question. Yeah, and hats off to Leslie Green. She's amazing. I've met her a few times when we did screenings of Unearthed at UCT, which she arranged for her classes. I think she's in the States now or somewhere. She's amazing. I haven't read the book yet, but I definitely need to put that on my list. Yeah, Cape Town. Oh, Cape Town can get you down. On the one hand, you have these like incredible, this beauty, these natural resources, and it's a city that has a mountain and forests and a beach and very unique ecosystems and fauna and flora. And it's a wonderful place to live in when you can focus on enjoying those natural resources without having to worry about how you're going to put bread on the table. And I think that the city just like blows my mind on a daily basis in how you can have these incredibly contradictory experiences. You read about these like mansions in Clifton that sell for like an unimaginable figure to foreign sort of visitors, or and then you just have to drive for 20 minutes on the N2 or where and see how other people are living and it's just like it's mental how that can exist in one space. And I think that's really what's so heartbreaking about what apartheid did to the city in terms of just from an architectural spatial planning point of view, just really wrecked things. And it's just like we've never really fixed that or paid it enough attention from a meaningful sort of long-term strategy point of view. And it just, I've been in Cape Town now for 10 years, and I just have never really seen any real commitment to address that from a governmental point of view, and also from people with means and who enjoy the fine life in Cape Town. I think there are amazing NPOs if you think of like Reclaim the City and the work that they're doing, and there are a lot of really important sort of movements out there that are working to sort of share information and sort of build and from a legal point of view get behind cases that we need to support sort of a lower middle income housing in the CBD or in the sort of affluent areas of Cape Town. So I think there's a lot of incredibly inspiring people who are my age and our age out there who are really taking this head on. But yeah, it's I don't really know if I'm giving you a concrete answer. For me, it's very much like an experiential thing. It's the fact that I can be in my home where I have access to electricity and running water, and I live comfortably, and I can hop in my car and 15 minutes away is someone who's honestly afraid of leaving their home at night to go to sort of shared ablution facilities because of the threat of like gender-based violence and being robbed. I mean, it's just like it is mind-blowing, and I think that it's a huge thing to address and to fix, and I hope it's like front of mind for the people who have the ability to change those things. But I just am really, I get quite deflated when I see that like it hasn't really changed much, and it's so complicated. Where does one begin?
I think it's a matter of balancing those who know what we need to do to change, because there are some incredible solutions for transformation and transitions. But it's about capacitating those people and really listening to those voices that are coming through. because I do believe that the solutions are out there. It's just a matter of listening and giving passing the mic. But before I ask my last question,
That's so true. Yeah, I would say Cape Town is not good at passing the mic, and it's not good at turning down the volume on whiteness and the volume on privilege and the volume on favoring sort of massive financial gains, and these sort of, you hear about these deals that were made where they sell pieces of land, prime property and that kind of thing. And I think that's what's disappointing. It's like the city really it's like, it doesn't even look accidental, right? It's just like, just no real effort of engaging with communities and community organizations and listening and building sort of community-led solutions.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you. And Jo, before I ask my last question, I just want to say to you, thank you so much for joining me and for your time and for your considered responses. And for any of the audience who would like to follow more of the work that you do, Jo is active on on Instagram, and you can follow her at Jolynn Minnaar. So Jo, your last question. Given your expertise, what question should I have asked you?
Well, this is such a good question. No one has ever put it back at me. I'm gonna ask you what question should I have asked you? I would say you haven't asked me what I've had for breakfast, which is something in the film world that's the first question we ask everybody, because it's like it's something we do to test the audio levels. So when we have a contributor sitting down, we have the mics up and we need to test sound, we typically say, what did you have for breakfast? So we didn't do that. I'm assuming because the sound recording was fine. Given your expertise, what question should I have asked you? No, I think you did an amazing job of really sort of traversing my interests and topics that I've dealt with, but then also diving into who I am as a person.
Thank you for joining me today at Earthcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review. Let's chat next episode, where I will be asking more creatives and intellectual disruptors about making decisions at the margin. See you next time.